Welcome everyone to this webinar on digital extremism and the city. My name is Scott Rodgers. I'm a senior lecturer here in media theory at Birkbeck University of London in the United Kingdom. I'm going to introduce our speakers for this session more fully in just a moment. That's Bharath, Ganesh, and Robert Topinka. But first, I just want to do a tiny bit of housekeeping. As the attendees of this webinar, you will have already noticed probably that your mic and camera have been switched off by default. And so what this means is that if you have any questions, and I hope you do, they can be submitted via the chat board. And please try and submit it to the Everyone forum if you can, because that way I can monitor all the questions coming in. The questions that you submit can be done at any time during the presentations, and I'll be monitoring them as they come in. I'll try to pose as many as possible during the discussion section of our event. The other bit of housekeeping is just to say that this event will be recorded and made available online afterwards. Obviously, as attendees, you won't be visible or audible during this recording, but if you do submit a question in the chat, I will read it out and I may mention your name to give some context. So just be aware of that. Okay, so today's webinar is actually part of a larger event series we have begun at Birkbeck around the broad theme of urban intersections. So what I'm going to do first is just briefly hand over to my colleague, Mara Nogueira, who's a lecturer in urban geography here at Birkbeck. She's going to say just a little bit more about the series in general before we introduce today's event in particular. Mara?
Thank you, both the speakers and Scott, for being here. Thanks for the participants. So my name is Mara Nogueira, and as Scott was saying, I'm a geography lecturer in the Department of Geography. I'm also the director for a new interdisciplinary cities program, which is an initiative that, in a way, is in dialogue with this webinar series, which we are calling Urban Intersections. And as the name gives away a little bit, what we are trying to do with this webinar series is to bring together different people from different backgrounds to promote transdisciplinary urban dialogues. The idea is that now, just like today, the idea is to invite scholars, but they can also be artists or practitioners, to reflect and enter into conversation around a particular urban topic from which they will speak about from their own discipline. So hopefully challenging those disciplinary perspectives by entering in dialogue with others. So we are then interested to stimulate conversations at the intersection of different disciplines, but also practices and spaces, medias and ways of seeing and understanding our urbanized and increasingly more urbanizing world. So apart from Scott and myself, the series is also convened and curated by our colleague Andrea Ballatore, who is, I suppose, hearing us now as well. So hi, Andrea, who is also a lecturer in the geography department, the same department where I'm based. So thanks all for coming, and I hope you can be usual guests in our webinar series that hopefully when things go back to normal, we can bring into the real physical world where we can also have more informal conversations around the same topics. Thanks a lot, and back to you, Scott.
Thanks, Mara. So now I'm just going to say a little bit about this webinar today on digital extremism in the city and introduce our speakers. So digital platforms, digital infrastructures have obviously been important for the activities and arguably the increased visibility of far-right, extreme, white nationalist, white supremacist individuals and groups. And there's been an awful lot of attention directed at the legitimacy of these groups, occupying, perhaps abusing these online spaces, often with impunity. Only recently, for example, in the face of large companies pulling lucrative ads, Facebook has finally begun to respond meaningfully to complaints that it often hosts hate speech. But what is sometimes left out of discussions around digital extremism is that its associated practices fundamentally take shape and circulate through localized contexts. So what we're interested in here is geographies that are inherent to digital culture. And one question I guess we're especially interested in today or this evening, depending on where you're connecting to us from, is thinking a little bit more carefully about the relationships of digital extremism and urban spaces. And specifically, one of the things we're going to be, or some of the things we're going to be thinking about is how the digitalized tropes, affects, infrastructures of the far right take shape in relation to the city. So our first speaker who's going to be tackling this is Dr. Bharath Ganesh, who is assistant professor of media studies at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. He's a political geographer focused on new media, political communication, and cultures of hate and intolerance online using computational as well as qualitative methods. His research has been published in journals such as Policy and Internet, Cultural Studies and Communication Research, and with Jonathan Bright, he's the co-editor of Extreme Digital Speech, Context, Responses, and Solutions. Our second speaker is my colleague, Dr. Robert Topinka, who's lecturer in transnational media and cultural studies here at Birkbeck, University of London. His research spans disciplines and time periods. He draws on urban studies, media theory, rhetoric, and aesthetics, and examines the history and present of media, race, and urban life. He's been published in journals such as New Media and Society, Visual Communication, and Citizenship Studies, and he's the author of the forthcoming book, Racing the Street, Race, Rhetoric, and Technology in Metropolitan London, 1840 to 1900. So each of our presenters are going to speak for around 20 minutes, and then we will move to a kind of a unified question and answer and discussion section. Just as a reminder, please do submit your questions throughout the presentations in the chat forum under the everything discussion, ideally. And what I'll be doing is I'll be posing these rather to speakers on your behalf. So without further ado, I guess we'll start with Bharath. Are you ready, Bharath?
Yes, I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Okay, good. Yes. Okay, I'm hoping everyone can see the slides I've shared. So just by way of starting, I think just to let you know a little bit about who I am. I did my PhD in geography at UCL. I finished back in 2017. My PhD research actually isn't really related to the far right, but it was more about multiculturalism and focused more in cultural studies as well. But today what I want to talk about are kind of the ways in which the far right imagines the city. And I'm going to explain a little bit more about that in a few slides. A lot of this kind of work and my interest in this area started out actually while I was doing my PhD at UCL. I was working for an organization in the UK called Tell Mama. MA stands for Monitoring Anti-Muslim Attacks. So a lot of my kind of interest and understanding of the far right kind of comes from monitoring and understanding hate speech and hate crimes and the relationship between online discourse and some of and the experience of hate crimes. So that's a little bit of background for me. So my title for the talk today is Invaded, Degenerate, and Untraversable. And these are sort of three tropes that I've sort of noticed in my work around kind of the far right and how they talk about the city. So I'll get into that in a little bit. But anyway, it's really a pleasure to be here and to actually do a bit of work with the geography audience, which I haven't done in some time. So this has been a welcome project for me. Before we get started, I just want to note the presentation. I've used a lot of data and images from stuff that I've collected. So there's going to be instances of hate speech, images of violence, extremist discourse, reference to violence against women, and racist imagery that is in the presentation. Obviously, I'm not presenting this to amplify it, but more to try to cast some critical light and better understand the way that the far right is imagining the city. So just to give you a little background on what I've been doing the last few years, so kind of finishing up a postdoc at the Oxford Internet Institute and then here at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. What I've been doing really is focusing on studying far-right digital publics in Western Europe and North America, focusing on Twitter. Now, I haven't really been using a lot of geographical theory in my work. I'm much more kind of focused on media studies at the moment. But when I'm using the term far-right digital public, I'm really thinking about these kinds of large networks composed of a variety of different kinds of actors that inhabit and occupy online spaces. Now, the majority of my work is tending a little bit more towards looking at the ways in which platforms are trying to govern this stuff. And that's kind of the current research project. But that's come out of two projects I've kind of wrapped up recently. So the first one was kind of looking at how is it that, and so these are the research questions kind of driving those initial two studies. The first one looks at how is affect used strategically by alt-right influencers in far-right political communication and by audiences. And so that's kind of something I've worked on in a recent project that's available now at Cultural Studies. And then second, and this is some of my collaborative work with Dr. Caterina Froyo at Sciences Po. And there we've been looking at kind of comparing different ways in which far-right digital publics operate, looking at political communication within them. And we've been comparing that across the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and Italy. And there our kind of question was, what are the imaginaries of Europe that have been produced by far-right digital publics? So what I'm going to be reflecting on today is kind of a lot of the data that I've collected in order to finish those projects, neither of which were really looking at imaginaries of the city or trying to think about the kind of urban geographies that are imagined by the far right. So that wasn't really the objective of these subjects. But through these projects, one of the things that happened was I collected loads of data on Twitter. What I'm going to do is kind of present some reflections on some of the things that I've learned about how the far right talks about the city based on those data sets. Now, I appreciate we're mostly an academic audience here. I'm not going to be talking a lot about theory today. This is primarily going to be a descriptive discussion about these different tropes. And perhaps I hope it'll be kind of the start of a dialogue to get you thinking a little bit about what kinds of questions might scholars of urban life want to ask about the far right. And so a couple weeks ago, basically, Rob had asked me if I wanted to take part in a discussion about the far right in the city. And this is a result of a few reflections I've put together over the last couple of weeks. But I hope that it might be the start for some more theoretical discussion. So like I said, this is going to be a really descriptive look at some of the imaginaries of the city in these data sets. And towards the end, I'll connect with some of the theoretical work I've been thinking about. So I've put together these three tropes, and that really comes from a lot of the data that I've been looking at, and a lot of the, I spent a lot of time reading what it is that far-right users talk about online, as well as kind of the literature that you find elsewhere. And I think these three terms kind of really help us try to understand what it is that the far-right imagines the Western city to be. And what's interesting is that these three tropes repeat themselves over and over again. They're used to describe London. They're used to describe, as you will see in the quote I'm going to read in a minute, Paris, Rotterdam, Amsterdam. It repeats itself in discussions about Stockholm, Malmö, as well as Brussels. And what we see is kind of this, or at least what I've started to notice is this kind of generic imaginary of the Western city as this place that is at the same time invaded, degenerate, and untraversable. And I'll try to make sense of what that is a little as we go along. But I want to start out with this quote from Douglas Murray. Some of you might know him. He's, I think he's the editor of The Spectator, a major conservative newspaper in the UK. He's also one of the leaders at the Henry Jackson Society, which is ostensibly a think tank based in London that has some serious links with organized Islamophobia across the world. And Douglas Murray wrote this book, The Strange Death of Europe. And here he's really getting into and connecting with kind of broader white supremacist conversations about what's usually referred to as the Great Replacement in kind of Francophone literature, or white genocide, which is really this obsessive belief that the way that existing birth rates play out in Western countries, especially in Western Europe, is creating the seeds for the destruction of European culture, whatever that might be, and its eventual replacement by non-native cultures. And the main anxiety is primarily about Islam and Muslims. Now, just to get us started, here's a quote from Douglas Murray's book. He writes, "Traveling on the deep underground RAR often feels like taking an underground train in an African city." And here he's obviously referring to the metro network in Paris. "Most of the people are black and they are making their way far out to the suburbs. Those places where the RAR stops in Paris's chic centers, Châtelet, for example, are known as areas where there can be trouble, especially in the evening when bored youths from the banlieues hang around in town. Nobody can experience this light, airy feeling in the center of Paris and the deep swell of other people underneath and not sense that there is something amiss. The same feeling will strike anybody traveling through certain towns in the north of England or neighborhoods of Rotterdam and Amsterdam. Today, it can also be experienced in the suburbs of Stockholm and Malmö." So again, this is what I'm trying to communicate with this quote, is that what Murray is talking about is the sense of the city being lost, right? This idea that there's all of these migrants who travel on trains and have actually changed the kind of the character and the demographics of the city, right? And so here we should be very much aware of kind of the white supremacist tropes that Murray is playing with. Now, what's also interesting, right, is that this kind of imaginary that he is developing here in this book is tightly related to multiculturalism and other Northern European countries that have multicultural societies. And here, what he's trying to do is trying to draw this kind of generic imaginary of this kind of multicultural city being taken over by diversity that's kind of common across Northern Europe. Now, if we turn to this image on the right, we can kind of see how this works out. This comes from one of my studies. This was an image that I found using a random sample of images from Twitter users. And here what we see are kind of these tropes at work, right? We see before diversity and after diversity. And in that very first one on the top left there, you can see how there's this kind of image of before diversity. You have primarily white people walking around a kind of generic looking European city. And then after diversity, there's this repetition of images, primarily of Muslim women wearing Islamic dress. Similarly, on the right-hand side, I'm sure all of you will recognize before diversity, we have London's buses and in its cities. And then, of course, you have an image of the 7/7 attacks. Now, this keeps repeating itself. So this is just one example. But I think in a way, this image kind of captures exactly what I'm trying to talk about. That this is one of the ways in which kind of white supremacist ideas about the city are being laundered. And again, diversity is really kind of the central trope that holds all of this together. So let me just explain these three kind of components of this imaginary that I want to discuss today. So the first one is the idea that it's invaded, right? So the character of Western cities is threatened by migrants. And here we have the term mass immigration, which Douglas Murray is absolutely obsessed with, and it resonates throughout these. On the left, you can see kind of another such image of kind of how the character of Europeans' urban centers is changing. In the middle here, we have this kind of concept or trope of the city as degenerate. And this is kind of the idea that inhabitants of Western cities especially in these metropolitan areas, enable the migrant threat, right? And what this really connects with is, on the one hand, in far-right and white supremacist ideology, what we tend to see is that migrants, and primarily Muslims, are seen as kind of like threatening objects, but they're not rendered with any kind of agency. The only reason that they're there, the only reason that they matter, is because the white liberals specifically kind of enabled them to arrive, right? So here we're also seeing kind of a key aspect in terms of white supremacist ideology, right? It's the migrants don't really have any agency, but it's the kind of quote unquote degenerate leftists that allow them in that really are the ones responsible for this situation. And then finally, the third piece is untraversable, and it's kind of the idea that these multicultural urban spaces are a threat to white bodies, and it's encapsulated in this no-go zone myth. And what we see over and over, and this is a white supremacist trope, goes all the way back to kind of fears about miscegenation in the United States in the 18th and 19th centuries, is we see kind of attacks by non-white men on white women as kind of the sort of primary way of explaining why these are no-go zones, right? And there's a long history. If you want to learn a little bit more about that, Abby Ferber's book, White Man Falling, is a really good place to understand how those tropes came about and the role of white women in white supremacist ideology. Get into each of these in a little bit more detail. I'm sorry for giving you more Douglas Murray quotes, but it really does kind of capture some of these anxieties. So one of the other kind of, if we get into this idea about invasion, right, it's about the way in which kind of the character and the demographic character of cities are changing, but it's also about how the built environment is changing. So I'm not going to read this whole quote, but here Murray is making some claims about immigrant communities and integration. And he writes, for example, pubs very often close in those areas of the United Kingdom where Pakistani and other Muslim migrants have moved in large numbers. If the newcomers were becoming as British as anyone else, as government ministers and others insist that they are, then the pubs would remain open and the new arrivals drink lukewarm beer like everybody else who had lived on the street before them. So here we've got, on the one hand, right, this idea that people are arriving in the United Kingdom or other places in Europe, and they're not maintaining the very same kind of traditions that would be expected, right? But here it's really this kind of muscular and extreme expectation that anyone arriving in the UK should have to follow all of those customs, right? And those aren't typically, and they shouldn't be, the kinds of ideas about integration that we have in a democratic society. However, this is kind of something that kind of captures this idea, right? And you can hear it in much more kind of quiet ways, which is kind of like this sense that, oh, our country doesn't look the way it used to, right? That you see shops now on the high street that have letters and words in Polish and in Arabic, right? And this is part of that anxiety that goes along with this concept of invasion. Now, the term invasion actually appears over and over and over again in descriptions of Europe. So in a way, we might also want to think about how the idea of Europe as a whole is also represented by these urban spaces that are being invaded. So on the right here is another image from a random sample of Twitter users that I pulled a while back. And here we see someone writing, migrants occupy a pedestrian zone in Germany to pray, and it doesn't sound peaceful, right? Again, what we have, right, is this repetition of this anxiety about urban space changing and not maintaining whiteness in the very kind of, in these aspects of the built environment. Now, the invasion trope is kind of like really, really important when we're talking about London, right? Because the mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, is kind of the kind of presented often as evidence of this successful invasion, right? And so because he's a Muslim man that now, you know, is a mayor of the city of London, and pushing a particular policy agenda that is primarily associated with the social democratic project, though I imagine that's a debate we might want to have another time. This kind of presentation of Sadiq Khan as such really draws on existing far-right and Islamophobic tropes of entryism. So there's been a long discussion kind of over the last 15, 20 years about kind of how ostensibly and allegedly Muslims are trying to enter into government in order to install Sharia law and again kind of engage in this kind of broader kind of great replacement project, right? And that's something that's been there in Islamophobic discussions for quite some time. So, I mean, we can see kind of various ways in which kind of Sadiq Khan gets ridiculed and attacked here. But again, it's places like London, it's places like Amsterdam, etc., that kind of have a lot of centrist, social democratic, and leftist politicians who kind of created this space for political correctness, which has then enabled all of this kind of violence. Now, on the bottom left here, I think you can see now with this pointer. This is a tweet from former British National Party activist Mark Collett, who's kind of undeniably white supremacist. This is the tweet he's pinned on to his Twitter profile at any time you go on there, and it's one of the most kind of retweeted tweets of his. He writes, and this is in reference, I think, to the London Bridge attack a few years ago in 2017, if I'm not mistaken. This is Sarah. She was killed by Muslim terrorists because politicians care more about diversity and immigration than they do about our safety. So again, this kind of flows into the next point here, which is this idea of cities degenerate. So here's a few tweets and images from those tweets that kind of reinforce and kind of help us understand what they mean by this, right? So again, on the top left, we have Mark Collett again making a sarcastic remark about what third world immigration does to Europe, right? And lamenting some changes about Paris. I wasn't actually able to verify if this image even is Paris. But the point is that this is the kind of image that we see over and over again to kind of describe the city. And just below it is a meme that one of my students found in their research about the Internet Research Agency, and that's the quite infamous now troll farm that was based in St. Petersburg that was engaging in kind of social media manipulation with regards to the United States election in, between 2015 and 2017, right? So you have this kind of idea of sort of American modernism with Trump built this, liberals built this, and again, it's kind of trying to show that what liberals build are slums, right? Again, we see here, this is what California under Jerry Brown looks like. I'm pretty sure this is Los Angeles, right? And California has one of the biggest homeless populations in the country. And again, right, it's really about kind of blaming this on liberal politicians or centrist or social democratic politicians. And again, the sort of trope about diversity keeps coming back, right? So on the right, we have this apparently replaced offensive Christmas trees in Germany with the diversity tree of multiculturalism. This again comes from right-wing activists in the United States, Jack Posobiec. So again, what we're seeing is this kind of like, there's this binding between the invasion and then the degeneracy of the center, the left, and social democratic politics. And this kind of comes together, that flows then into this point about untraversability. And so here we have, this is something that was retweeted by a 4chan Twitter account that pushes stuff from 4chan onto Twitter. The tweet is just, all it says is, this is the state of the West. And what you have is a young girl who's at some kind of, I wasn't really able to determine exactly what this event is, but she's standing behind these two police officers who are fully armed. And the original poster says, "For a candid shot, it's actually extremely profound and really illustrates the West's problems." And it says underneath, "Very young girl, belly shirt, bunny ears." Again, this is going back to those tropes about degeneracy. Extremely naive look, does not notice how extreme the security has to be so she can listen to the brainwash. And then, "This is normal, this is fun." Right? So again, it's showing how this kind of the processes of invasion, the idea that these cities are degenerate, is leading to the fact that they have become fundamentally insecure for white people. So this leads into the no-go zone trope. I think Rob's going to talk about that a lot more, and I don't have time really to give you like a whole history of what that trope is or where it comes from. It's existed for quite some time, and it's really deeply associated with Islamophobic and white supremacist thought across Europe and North America. But some of you might know this character, Rahim Kassam. He's used to be, I think, editor at Breitbart London. And he wrote this whole book about no-go zones. It's titled "No-Go Zones: How Sharia Law is Coming to a Neighborhood Near You," published by a kind of conservative publisher in the United States. And the prologue to it, written by none other than Nigel Farage. And so now what we're going to start seeing is how these no-go zones have basically created this idea of urban spaces as, and especially the kind of multicultural urban spaces, as being untraversable. So in one part of this book, where he's talking about Molenbeek in Brussels, which is a kind of an infamous district that's had a lot of attention for some jihadists coming from that area. So first he defines no-go zones as such, and he writes an area, so he defines no-go zones as an area in which the likelihood of being attacked, accosted, or otherwise abused on the basis of your appearance or the bigotry of locals is higher on average than elsewhere in the city or country in question. A no-go zone may refer to an area in which police require authorization or acceptance from a religious figure or community leader before entering, or indeed where the rule of law has either broken down or been supplanted by a foreign set of rules. Now, I couldn't find any hard evidence that this has actually happened. I'm really not sure that there's actually instances in which this is the case. But what I think Kassam is trying to get at is that there's this claim that, especially when we look at, for example, the case of child sexual exploitation in Rotherham, that religious figures and community leaders kind of are gatekeepers for the police to kind of act. And what we see, again, allegedly, this is not true, nor is it actually covered in any of the reports that were published, but the idea that there's a kind of sense of political correctness that prevents the police from actually doing or taking any action in these ostensible no-go zones. And again, if you read the report on child sexual exploitation in Rotherham, that's really not quite what the auditors are saying, but that's how it's been spun primarily by kind of the right-wing media system in the United Kingdom. So to make it a little bit more concrete, and I would encourage some of you who have the stomach for it to read it, because his kind of approach to urban ethnography is pretty ridiculous. He has all of these guides that take him around, but he explains nothing about who these guides are, you know, what they're about, where they come from, what their lives are, right? But he still makes his claim to like, oh, I went there and I experienced these places, and then now I'm reporting back to you the truth, right? And this is a very disingenuous approach. But he writes, Molenbeek, within spitting distance of the political capital of Europe, namely Brussels, is often described as one of Europe's most notorious no-go zones. However, if you look like me, or rather, you don't look like a white blonde woman or an undercover police officer, you can indeed go there. So I did. On a visit to Molenbeek in 2015, just days after the Paris massacres, our group was jeered at and heckled, and the women were told to cover their heads. Unmistakable tension rode high. The suspicion of the locals manifested itself in hateful, jingoistic, and barbarous ways. This wasn't Europe, this wasn't Brussels, this is what they call Little Marrakesh, where you must act accordingly or leave. Now, I think you can see the kind of ways in which these kind of anti-Muslim and kind of extremist, right-wing extremist ideas are really just sitting under the surface, right? I mean, there's description of this area as barbarous, but it's also, you know, really terrible analysis because we know really nothing about the context of his visit, right? It's just ostensibly they were jeered at, and we don't really know why or what happened. And we see this quite often. We'll have kind of provocateurs, like right-wing provocateurs, kind of go into cities. This happened, for example, in British cities, where they'll go and stir up tensions, and then they'll get harassed or they'll get shouted at by people in an urban area, and then they'll go back and say, oh look, you know, this is how I was treated when I went to this place. So again, I mean, there's not much reason to take these kind of claims seriously, but it's more useful than trying to understand the way in which the far right is trying to construct these places in a kind of broader imaginary. And then again, right, the idea that this is Little Marrakesh, any of you who might have been to Marrakesh would note that no such kind of incidents actually happen in such a place, or if they do, it is in incredibly limited contexts. Again, this is part of that imaginary. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it's really this kind of anxiety and kind of repetition, and this is happening, like I said, it's happening over centuries, of this construction of men of color as sexually deviant and as a direct threat to Western white women, right? And here we have Anne-Marie Waters. Some of you might know her. She's an extremist activist in the United Kingdom, writing about Europe's rape epidemic for Breitbart. And the reason I bring this up is because this particular article was shared really widely in that second study I mentioned when we were looking into imaginaries of Europe. And what we see is kind of, again, this same set of constructions about kind of these spaces that are kind of in these cities that have no-go zones within them, or a lot of migrants residing in them, as threatening specifically to to white women. So she writes, recently I traveled from Copenhagen to Malmö by train. Only moments after the train entered Swedish territory, I was witness to what I can only assume to be representative of the new Sweden. A young blonde woman was jogging and had the misfortune of passing a group of men who proceeded immediately to harass her. Readers will be more than aware that Sweden has become Europe's rape capital. And then she goes on to talk about Norway and Denmark, writing, in Norway, recent statistics reveal that 100% of violent street rapes committed in the capital city of Oslo were committed by non-Western immigrants. It's a similar story in Denmark, where the majority of rapes are committed by migrants, usually Muslim. Now, I can't comment here on the truth of these latter two claims. I'd have to go and do a fact check, and that would take me a little while, which I didn't have for this presentation. But again, the broader point here really is about how these spaces are being constructed as zones that white people can't traverse. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about a bit of data that I just kind of played around with. So this is like extremely preliminary, but just to get an idea of kind of how do these broader audiences of people like Anne-Marie Waters and far-right discourse tend to sort of talk about or imagine no-go zones. So I scraped a little bit of data from 4chan, the Donald's Reddit, and the conservative subreddit, and I did this. Is really easy to do with some tools that the folks at the University of Amsterdam who run the Open Intelligence Lab put together. Some really fantastic tools that they have. And so I did this really quickly just to get kind of just a general idea of where I might go if I'm trying to think a little bit more about these no-go zones and how they're being constructed and talked about. Right, and all of these tropes that I've been talking about kind of keep coming back. I imagine you can't really see it, and I'm afraid I don't think I have a zoom function. But you can see here it says, so basically here what we're doing is looking at kind of these word trees basically look at kind of common constructions within different kinds of posts that kind of help us come up with, at an aggregate, what does this discourse sort of look like? So we have kind of, if we follow this line down, it says whole country is a no-go zone. Again, we have words like Muslim. Europe is a no-go zone. If we come down here to kind of how are no-go zones described, we have words like shot, assaulted, this phrase would whites, as in would whites go there, Swedish. Again, this really centers, at least on 4chan, really around Muslims. And again, I don't have really in-depth findings about any of this stuff, but this is just to give you a bit of an idea about how these kind of topics are being talked about. Again, on the Donald subreddit, Sweden comes up over and over again. Words like rape, fucking Sweden again. And then sort of some of the tropes that Rahim Kassam mentioned around police can't go in, and that sort of thing. And then finally, I wanted to see if this kind of, how much this may or may not have flown into some of the discussions on a more mainstream subreddit. And again, the sort of extreme language isn't as present, but we still see some of these tropes being repeated. So again, what I showed you there was really quite rough, and it was just to get an idea. But I want to go back for a minute and kind of as a reminder, sort of talk about, if we're thinking about zones, what we need to keep in mind. And I think this is why, for me, it has to come back to hate crime, and we need to kind of think about these aspects. So Kassam earlier says this, right? Sorry, it's a little laggy when I flip through the slides. An area in which the likelihood of being accosted, attacked, or otherwise abused based on the basis of your appearance is higher than on average than everywhere else in the city or country in question. So this is some data that I collected and that was provided by the Metropolitan Police Service when I was working for Tell Mama. It's a charity. You can find the report online. But what we see is that actually hate crime is an extremely serious issue, especially in London. And it's, there's theses about the spatial distribution of hate crime being kind of focused on Muslim areas. And so I have a really kind of, it's been a while, and this is one of the first kind of quantitative models I've done, so it's not super legit. But one of the things I found in it that was a pretty serious concern, and we did have some, we were able to corroborate this kind of with other evidence as well, is that areas where there's a high level of public transport accessibility and areas where there's a large number of mosques tend to get a lot of hate crimes. But the strongest factor really was public transport accessibility. So what we found was that kind of on the main arterial roads in London, when people are walking around or waiting for the bus or something like that, that's where people tend to get abused the most. So when we're talking about no-go zones as places where you might be attacked for your actual appearance, right? These are the places where Muslim women who are visibly Muslim or choose to wear a hijab or other kind of Islamic garment are much more likely to be attacked or accosted, right? And these are actually kind of confirmed hate crimes from the Metropolitan Police. So kind of coming back and talking about no-go zones, I feel like I have to mention that in using Kassam's definition, then what does London become to someone, to a person of color or to a person who's Muslim? So I'm going to conclude. I think I've gone on a little bit long, so I thank you, Scott, for your generosity. I just want to kind of ask a few questions about how do we think about white supremacy in the city in the context of digital extremism, right? So we've got this idea about European culture being under threat, which is connected to this white genocide conspiracy. We have this idea that leftists have desecrated the modern city, which then gets into the cultural Marxist conspiracy that we've been seeing. As I said, it's about, we see this kind of racist construction of men of color as sexually deviant and posing a threat to white women. So these are the kind of broader ideological issues, and that's more what I tend to work on and what I tend to focus on. Elsewhere, I've sort of talked about this idea that in documenting all of this, these people involved in the far right, these actors, are constructing the sense that white people are kind of ostensibly marginalized by what's going on. So this idea that they're using this as evidence to support the claim that their identity is being suppressed in their own country. So I thought I might finish off now with some initial questions for urban geographers. So again, it's been a while, and I hope these aren't terribly dull questions. But I wonder, how might we reconsider the right to the city in the context of these white supremacist claims about invasion and integration and the desire for the maintenance of whiteness in the built environment? How might urban multicultures be signals or signs of the desecration of the whiteness of the city? And how are the intensities and affects of everyday multicultural life in the city rendered as signs of invasion, degeneracy, and untraversability? So with that, thank you very much, and I'll wrap it up there, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Bharath. That was really interesting, not at all too descriptive. In fact, I thought it struck a really good balance between description and sort of interrogation, and some of the questions that have already popped up in the chat show that I think you've provoked a lot of thoughts in people. So like I've said to everyone, we're going to have a question and answer and discussion at the end of both presentations. So Rob, if you're ready to switch on your camera, switch on your mic, and get started, we'll turn over to you.
Okay. Thanks, Bharath, for a really interesting talk. I think there'll be some intersections we can talk through in the Q&A. And thanks to Scott and Mara and Andrea for inviting me to this. So I guess I'll give a little bit of background like Bharath did. I'm also someone who did PhD research more focused on the city and have sort of moved away. So I did my PhD at Northwestern University in the US, and it was in a rhetoric program. So I'm trained as a rhetoric scholar, and that book Scott mentioned, which actually exists now. You can get it at the University of California Press website if you're interested. It looks at how race and mediation shaped the city, specifically 19th century London, and how race and media shaped governance and infrastructure. And I'm in a sort of very different place now, but asking similar questions and finding that the city is something that is becoming increasingly important, sort of as events change, as I'll talk about, but also as my interests change. So I'm currently working on an AHRC grant with Alan Finlayson and Cassian Osborne-Carey at the University of East Anglia, and it's on the alt-right as a case study, but it's a case study of what Alan calls politics in the wild, right? Where do politics come from? Where do ideologies come from? How do they take shape? So if you know anything about rhetoric, you'll know Aristotle defined it as identifying the available means of persuasion. So in modern parlance, we might say rhetoric is a capacity or an affect or a disposition to being persuaded. So what my work has been looking at and what I've been trying to bring to this project with Alan and Cass is how do platforms and digital media more broadly arrange and rearrange affects? How do they sort of bring things together, dissolve them, and then maybe return them again? And the city is returning, I think, to the fore. So, you know, the classic sort of tale of the right in the city is, or reactionary forces in the city is maybe Ausman in Paris or Robert Moses in New York, and you have the kind of reactionary crushing the convivial culture of the city, and that's why Lefebvre is called for the right to the city. And recently, the right sort of has been trying to stake, in some ways, a claim to the city as sort of the right in the city. So we had the infamous Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in August 2017, and that sort of seemed like a replay of this classic story where you had, but perhaps with a populist twist, right, where you had a right-wing president, and so alt-right and reactionary forces were emboldened to appear in public and try to retake the city. But I think what's surprising, perhaps, about this march is that it arguably backfired. So this is admittedly crude. This is Google Trends searches, worldwide searches for the alt-right. And you can see there are three peaks. The first is in mid-September 2016, when the Clinton campaign announced that Pepe the Frog was a white nationalist symbol. November 2016 after Trump's election, and August 2017 after the Unite the Right rally, and interest has not recovered since. So the question is why? And it seems that the far right can't claim the city, or at least it can't as an organized movement. And the reason for this, I want to think through in this talk, is that the forms of the far right that take shape in digital spaces, so 4chan, 8chan, Telegram, Discord, Twitter, Facebook, etc., are not movements, but affective arrangements. And I also think the city, as Bharath has shown, and I want to show in some other contexts, plays a key role as a kind of animating fantasy in these affects. And specifically, I want to talk about how the city appears as a battle space, but also as a kind of a game space, rather than a political space as such. So the alt-right, the Proud Boys, the Boogaloo Boys, these sorts of groups are often referred to as movements. But I think this phrase tends to obscure more than it reveals. And I think we should think about these groups, and particularly I'm going to talk quite a bit about the Boogaloo Boys today, as sticky bits of affect, or coagulations of a particular kind of affective style. So in this sense, they're similar to subcultures. They're sort of like highly mediated subcultures, but I think they're also less stable and more unpredictable than subcultures. So as part of this grant I mentioned that's been running for, I don't know, time is confusing me now post-lockdown, but about 2.5 years, we've been studying the alt-right. I was also studying it before, as the kind of spaces where I was a lurker were increasingly inflected by this kind of nationalist, masculinist, racist kind of tendencies. So these last 5 years for me have been a lesson in accelerated history, where first there were these kind of racist and masculinist and reactionary tendencies, and then they got a brand name in the alt-right, and suddenly a lot more attention. But also these reactionary kinds of affects also tend to rely on obscurity of a certain kind, the role of the unknown outsider. So in some ways, all this attention has undermined the alt-right. In other ways, it hasn't, but in some ways, it's lost its edginess that Richard Spencer was so smugly proclaiming that it had. And the same thing is happening almost even more quickly with the Boogaloo Boys. It's sort of become the new reactionary movement. Explainers are popping up in mainstream media and white papers, identifying the symbols and memes the groups use. So with the alt-right, it was Pepe the Frog, it was Conservatives, it was Red Pills. With the Boogaloo Boys, it's Breaking 2, Electric Boogaloo, Hawaiian Shirts, wood chippers, and Fashwave, which are the images you can see here. The Become Ungovernor and the Hello Fuck Boys. It's a militarized version of Vaporwave, which is an internet aesthetic that's this nostalgia, glitchy, surreal take on consumer culture. And Fashwave uses this sort of same aesthetic, but militarizes it, often makes it explicitly racist. So some of these symbols and memes can be explained pretty easily. Hawaiian shirts are worn to luau's. At a luau, you roast a pig. The Boogaloos hate the police. Police are pigs. The wood chippers are a threat to mainstream politicians who are going to be fed feet first to the wood chipper, as they frequently say. Some of these memes can only be explained by describing what happened on the internet. So the 1984 film Breaking 2, Electric Boogaloo, has long been a meme for anything done a second time. And there's no reason for it. That's just how message board users started using it. And that's how digital culture and digital politics often work. Discourse is associative. It's the product of arrangements and rearrangements. It's not representational. It's not symbolic. Memes, in some senses, are hermeneutically meaningless. There's nothing to unpack. But using a meme correctly shows you know the subculture it comes from. There's a really good article Yuval Katz and Lemur Schiffman have written where they make this argument showing that memes work through exclusivity. They don't bring groups together. They signal in groups and out groups. So there's sort of an inverse relationship between how popular a meme is and how effectively powerful, how it's affective force. So the more mainstream it becomes, the less effective force it generates. So by the time normies or newbies know about the meme, it's already obsolete. And this is already happening with the Boogaloo Boys. So this is a screenshot from Patriot Wave 2.0. And the things I'm going to show you today are very much works in progress. And I've been contending with the welcome news, I suppose, that Facebook is finally trying to do something about hate speech and groups advocating violence. So Patriot Wave was the biggest group It used to have about 13,000 members. It was banned and reborn as Patriot Wave 2.0. It has around 10,000 members now. And this meme is playing on the contingency of memes and saying, okay, you want to talk about how we wear Hawaiian shirts? Well, the shirts don't matter. They're entirely contingent, right? We can switch to CNN, and it doesn't matter. And sorry, just before I go to this slide, I should have said this earlier, as Bharath did, that I'm also going to be showing hate speech, speech advocating violence, and depictions of violence. So here it comes from 4chan. So this is from Paul, the Paul board. The K board is usually considered kind of where the Boogaloo Boys were formed, but also on Paul. And you can see this is from about 9 days ago. And they're making fun of the Boogaloo Boys as a LARP, a live action role play, a glow op, which is 4chan speak for CIA infiltration. The 4chan board, especially Paul and Kay, are obsessed with being infiltrated by CIA psyops. So this is why I think we need to think about the way affect sticks together, and also the way it's soluble, the way it coagulates and then comes apart, because these things come together and dissolve very quickly. So the question really is not whether this is a movement, but what kind of fantasies these sorts of affects animate. Okay, so in the case of the Boogaloos, the city as a symbol of rebellion looms large, and they tend to view the city as a game space that they can enter as avatars, and that extends this ubiquitously digital political realm. And this links to a kind of a politics that actually rejects the idea of coherent movement. So this is a screenshot from Hate Lab. It's a Telegram channel, it has about 2,000 members. It was forwarded to Acceleration Architecture, which is another Boogaloo Boys affiliated or sort of related Telegram channel. And it's also been shared on the Boogaloo Intel Drop, which is another channel I'll talk about. So you can see they're saying, forget politics, don't have a name, don't have a symbol. That gives them a target. They also say, significantly, learn your geography, right? So forget the politics, know your local space, and reject movementarianism. So when I say, these groups aren't movements, that's not to try to say that they're not dangerous or that they're not important, right? Leaderless resistance has been a strategy of white nationalists and neo-Nazis for years, well before digital platforms sort of made that kind of non-hierarchical, networked style of organization even easier. So it's not to say they're not dangerous, but it is to say that we can't think of them as sort of these coherent movements with an agenda and a set of demands. So I think this is where the link comes between digital extremism and recent work in particular in platform urbanism, which is trying to think about platforms as recombinatory modular machines that reshape urban space. So Sarah Barnes calls platforms ecosystems of interaction. And this is really clear with, for example, the Chaz or the CHOP in Seattle, which existed as much, if not more, on digital platforms as it did in those 6 blocks in Seattle. So it was as much on Twitch and Twitter as it was in that 6 block area. So this is why Gillian Rose has said we should stop thinking about objects and subjecting them to close reading, which is certainly my tendency as someone who's trained in the humanities, right? And think about things like scale, modes of distribution, mutability. So this is what I think thinking about affect and affective coagulates helps you do. Think about stickiness and solubility and contingency. So this is from Acceleration Architecture, the group I already mentioned. And again, they're rejecting this idea that the symbols are what relate to the politics, right? So don't start a named logoed group and proceed to wear your merch to a protest without covering your face, right? Instead, wear camo and cover your face and don't have an ID. So there's still a kind of aesthetics involved, but they're basically saying the Boogaloo Boys have the wrong aesthetics here. And the same thing happens on Boogaloo Intel Drop, which is critiquing the Boogaloo Boys for playing dress up and kissing unloving and blacks at rallies, right? So they're, and these Telegram groups tend to be more outwardly racist, more kind of straightforwardly white nationalist and neo-Nazi. But racism is still an animating force in the kind of more mainstream group. So this is, again, from Patriot Wave, and this is an image that's been shared, and there's versions of it that are overlaid with a kind of Fash Wave filter. And this is a Boogaloo boy, or at least a man in a Hawaiian shirt, gun on, holding hands with a Black Matter rally. And they're saying, forwarding this as kind of a model. But you see the first comment below, you might not be able to see it, a little small. Siding with communists is a quick way to get a bullet to the head when you let your guard down. So there's this way that the more mainstream kind of iterations of the Boogaloo Boys want to deny racism and even say, you know, we could align with Black Lives Matter. But you see racism as an animating fantasy throughout this group, even where they're trying to explicitly deny that they're racist. So this post on the right was in response to an article Jason Wilson published in The Guardian, noting that Joe Jorgensen, the Libertarian president or candidate for president in the US, appeared on a podcast that's run by some of the administrators of this group. And he noted correctly that they use a lot of racist imagery on the board. And they say, we're not racist, we want everyone to work together. Rhodesia, well, that was not white supremacy. It was a remarkably free land. Nazis had the best aesthetic. So you can see the kind of difficulty of engaging with these groups, because of course Rhodesia was white supremacist. It was explicitly white supremacist, right? But they're just saying, no, we just want the affect. We want the style. We want these pictures of Belgian soldiers in the shorts with the guns that you see in a lot of these kind of military, far-right military subcultures online. The same thing with Nazis, right? It's not about the Nazi ideology. It's about how cool their aesthetics were. So there's this kind of, you know, the irony of trolls has often been noted, but this is even kind of more further distance than that, of kind of aesthetic attachment, right? Where they're just saying, look, these are bits of aesthetic, bits of affect that are out there. We're just bringing them together because we like how they look, basically. So in a way, racism is kind of the obvious point. And if you were to engage with one of these groups, you would never get them to admit it, right? But the question is, how is racism animating the group? And I think we see kind of a version of Lacan's theft of enjoyment, right? Where Black people are either having too much fun or they're being too rebellious. They're kind of stealing our fantasy from us. So we need to reclaim it. And this links with what Hortense Spillers has called pornotroping, or this way that Black people are reduced to flesh that's either too violent or too sexualized, and often both. And in either case, it's erotic. And we'll see this in various ways. So here again is from Patriot Wave saying, pull up your bootstraps and act like a man, stop being so racist. The most liked comments in response first use the echo brackets that have become an anti-Semitic trope. The media, the Jewish media, is the subtext there, hates you. And then the next one is, you'll still be called racist, in this kind of bad approximation of African-American English. And the black groups will harass you. And at the bottom there, that's a boot with BLM written on it. And the idea is you're a bootlicker. So there's a sort of erotics of race that animates these groups. And you can see it even more clearly when they start talking about the city as a kind of battle space. So this is from Boogaloo Intel Drop after the shooting at the Wendy's in Atlanta, and after the Wendy's was burned down. And they're saying, look, the police are leaving these multicultural hot zones. And they shared this map that it's a racial dot map showing where Black people live in Atlanta, and saying, you know what's going to happen. So this is this image of the city as a post-apocalyptic battleground. It has a long history back to the Turner Diaries, where LA becomes the site of a race war. And here Black people are violent flesh in Spiller's terms, right? And there's an erotics to this fascination with the potential violence of the city. And here, this is another from Mujahideen Memes, which has been banned. But they're kind of making these crude battle maps of the city, right? So they're viewing the city like they're military strategists. And you also see a lot of images like this. So this is, again, from Boogaloo Intel Drop on the left, another brutal anti-white attack, hashtag White Lives Matter. And sort of as Bharath referred to, you get a lot of these images that appear without any context. And this is what I'm talking about with platforms as arrangements, right? They bring things together and take them away. You don't know where this came from. You just know that 6,400 people have seen it. but there's not a lot of context. I doubt many people are following up ABC7 to figure out where this came from. And then from Patriot Wave, which again has kind of tried to distance itself from racism, you get the same thing. Why don't people stop, referring to the recent rash of cars driving through protesters in the US in particular. This is why Karen. So they're using the Karen meme, which is usually used as a critique of sort of white supremacy or sort of the interfering racist white person who calls the cops on black people, to instead say, you're a Karen if you think that we shouldn't drive through Black Lives Matter protesters. And in the comments, you get this kind of erotic fascination with violence, right? Lock, glock, and roll. We should outfit a snowplow so we can burn our way through these protests. So this is from Corona Chan News. This is a Telegram channel based on a general post on Paul. So without getting too much into how Paul works, there's these general posts that sort of act as forums for discussion whenever there's a running topic. And so they've had Corona Chan News lately. And there's a Telegram channel based on it. And you see this comment, white man fires an AR-15 in Atlanta when Black Lives Matter surround his car. And the first question is, did he kill anyone though? Sadly, no, is the response. So this is kind of comes from a longstanding discussion on 4chan and on Paul in particular with body counts, in particular in mass shootings. And this is where the gamification of this sort of violence comes into play, where the city is viewed as a battle space, but also as a game space that you enter as an avatar of your digital subculture, and you try to perhaps achieve a high score. So this is from Paul back in June, talking about Chaz, or as it was called then, as a kind of battle space. And so Raz, who is a rapper who has a presence on SoundCloud, was live streaming quite a lot from Chaz, and he became a symbol in a lot of these sort of right-wing spaces as everything wrong with the protests. So he began to be called a warlord, which again is this obviously racially over-coded language, harkening back to kind of colonial fantasy, reminding us of this kind of Rhodesian imagery that the Boogaloo Boys like to use, and this idea that he is this fascinatingly violent person. That maybe how hard would it be for us to band together and show up with our guns and install our own right-wing dictatorship in this space. So this is kind of what the Proud Boys do, right? So this is a fight just outside the Chaz, where Proud Boys in their hoodies with their logos showed up and started a fight with someone who was trying to record the protest. Not a lot of context here, but what's interesting about this is, the Proud Boys gear is your costume, right? It's your video game avatar. You put it on, and then you can enter the city as an avatar of the Proud Boy subculture. And you see this coming kind of full circle with the memification of that couple in St. Louis who showed up to wave guns at protesters who they claimed were walking through their private property. I've actually since learned that they're squatting on that public street and trying to claim it as their own. It's not technically theirs. But that aside, they quickly became memified in this Grand Theft Auto Vice City meme. And so Grand Theft Auto takes place in 1986. It's kind of often cited as one of the key sources of the vaporwave aesthetic, right? This nostalgic, but also futuristic, gamified look at consumer culture. And they've placed the St. Louis shooter as an avatar in Grand Theft Auto Vice City. And so this has been happening for a long time. On the right is an image from 2015. These are two users on Paul who showed up at a Black Lives Matter protest in Minneapolis in 2015 and fired into the crowd. They shot 5 people. They were convicted of, I'm not exactly sure the crime, but they were convicted for shooting 5 people. And this is a still from a live stream that they linked to on Paul. You can find it on the Southern Poverty Law Center website. But if you watch it, they're using sort of what is now obsolete meme language, referring to going to see what these dindus are up to. That's an old meme that's kind of supposed to be a clever way to invent a racial slur that outsiders won't know about. It comes from the phrase "didn't do nothing," which is again a bad approximation of African American English, and it's this outdated meme slur. So this is kind of bringing me back to what I was saying before, where you have to think about the way affects sort of stick together and also dissolve, rather than think about movements, because in a way it's the same thing with different content, right? It's meme culture being shared on these groups, and then offering sort of a resource, a capacity for entering the city as a game space. So you can't get too caught up almost in what they're saying and what it means, where it comes from, but you have to find a way to understand the kind of fantasies it's animating. So what I think we're seeing is these groups thinking of the city as a game space that digital culture is layered onto and weaved into. So you don't leave your digital culture to enter the urban culture. They're a platform ecosystem of interaction, right, where you're moving through both spaces at once. And so I don't think we're going to see, and I hope we're not going to see, the right, being able to reclaim the city as a kind of organized movement. But this pattern of entering the street as an avatar of a kind of subcultural affective style is something that I think will continue to happen. And I'll end there and give us hopefully a little bit of time for questions.
Thank you, Rob. That was really, really excellent. It just continued on from Bharath's presentation really well, I think. Starting with Bharath speaking on tropes, and then you extending the discussion to think about the affects and their modulation through infrastructures, I think gives us a very rounded way of thinking about digital extremism in the city. So I think originally what I'd said my plan was going to be was that Bharath and Rob are going to engage with each other for a little bit, and then we'd have questions. I don't think we really have time to do that. So I think what we're going to do instead is I'm going to go right into the questions. I'm going to try to group them. I can see other ones coming in, which is making me extremely nervous, but I'm going to try and go through them in more or less in order, except try and group them some together and leapfrog over some that connect. So I want to start with the first question that came in. I think it's a good general question to start with because it deals with not just methodology, but I think really the experience of research. Hannah Alcock asks, I'm interested in the emotional toll this research takes on you. So this stuff is hard to see, but it is important we try to understand these narratives. How do you make sure this doesn't impact your mental health? And before you go to that question, the two of you, and I think it obviously relates to both your papers, another question I would connect it to actually is a later one by Ananya Sinha, who is sort of the other side to it, which is maybe are there ways in which the research findings you are coming across, the tropes, the affects, the memes, I'm sort of paraphrasing what she said, can these be transformed into something else, something like a public art project, she suggests, or opening up the city to some sorts of public education and that kind of thing. So those two kind of questions together to start with. Either one of you can take it, just to begin.
Rob, do you want to go ahead, or?
Sure, I can start a little bit. I mean, it is, I'm sure you feel the same way, Bharath. It is really difficult to do this research because there's a way this work is, these kinds of groups are trying to infect people's brains. I mean, that's kind of what they're trying to do. And I find myself wanting to argue a lot. So you almost have to kind of you have to be able to kind of turn your brain off while you're doing the research in a way. And just say, okay, I'm just going to kind of focus on how this works, treat it as kind of something external and not try to engage with it. Because as I tried to talk about with that Patriot Wave example, there's no winning an argument in these contexts. So you have to be able to kind of find a way to just sort of not think about it as you do the work. That's not a great answer. And I think, I mean, my honest answer is once I'm done with this grant, I might write about something very, very different because I think it's important to do this work, but it's awful. It really is. A very satisfying answer, I know.
How about you, Bharath?
Yeah, I mean, there is no good answer to this question, I think. Like, when I was doing this stuff on hate crime, we were sort of in an office where every day we're getting calls from victims, and we're there to support them. My job was to collect all of those incidents and then analyze them. And I think the way that we tended to deal with that, it's not necessarily constructive, but it's a coping mechanism, is a lot of black humor, and we found ways to get used to it, to laugh about it, and then we also became numb to it, I think, in a certain way. And so coming from that into looking at like memes and content hasn't been that painful for me, but I think it's because, you know, all those years I was kind of looking at this stuff. But I think what drives me over the wall every day, and it never goes away, the rage about this, which is, you know, the platforms aren't really doing a damn thing about any of this. You know, they act like they are, and they go around patting themselves on the back as though they're doing something, right? But for example, Twitter just took down all these generation identity accounts, right? But Mark Collette's been on there forever, right? And he's like a proper white supremacist. It's generation identity of both. I don't think there's much debate, but they're both debatable. Generation identity is a lot more debatable than Mark Collette is, right? And it's kind of, you know, every time I've tried to do any kind of like impact or engagement, you feel like you're really just talking to a clock. Like, you know, you say whatever you're going to say, they nod their heads, and then the clock keeps ticking, nothing changes. And over, you just see that they're not really willing to engage in really trying to counter any of this. So I think that's what drives me nuts. I have to say, you know, my answer is, in a way, I've become kind of numb to it. I mean, that's a really perhaps unfortunate and perhaps unhealthy way of dealing with it, but that's how it is for me. In terms of the second point, though, I mean, how do we? I'm really not a great person to ask about. What might an artistic project look like? I wonder, to some extent, you know, is trying to understand, like, if we're trying to think about a no-go zone, for example, right? What would a project look like to sort of get people to understand from the perspective of the people that are being targeted what that feels like? That might be a better starting point to try to break down some of the ways we talk about no-go zones. But also, I think another project might look at, like, the ways in, you know, like Preeti Patel had this whole thing about Leicester's textile factories, right? A couple weeks ago, or was it this week? I can't even remember now, right? Looking at how these mainstream media projections about these spaces actually resonate so much with the way in which the far right describes them, and then how people who live there actually have to talk about it. I think getting those voices of people targeted is probably the best way to go about it.
Thank you, Bharath. I have a series of related. I'm going to string together a series of questions. You can judge for yourself if you think these are actually related. But to me, there's a bunch of questions that deal with the degree to which some of what you've both been talking about relates to the othering of places in cities, or otherwise relates to counterposing the city against other places that might be considered non-urban. So I'll just go through these questions and I'll read them out mostly, and you can respond, I guess, as you wish. The first one's from Jason Luger. Jason says, Bharath, do you come across a corresponding romanticizing of the non-urban, or the ex-urban, the rural, the folk, or the volk, and by some of the same social media users that you've been studying? And he says, I'm thinking now of the return to the land that seems to be accelerating with COVID-19 lockdowns, and also with the Black Lives Matter protests. And actually, I'm going to jump right to the end. Simon Peth had a question saying, he said, thanks very much for your talk. I was wondering how far these extremist groups are only anchored or related to the city. So what role do rural areas play? Isn't digital extremism rather a translocal thing? Two more questions that I'm going to string into this. Gloria Lancy says, picking up on Jason's question, do you think this also could be related to a strategy to undermine specific neighborhoods in the inner city, along with real estate speculation? So I suppose that might be related to redlining, that kind of thing. And finally, Margaret Vassiliou says, question about these no-go zones. You've highlighted how this language is used to describe Muslim communities, I believe. Have you also seen this language being used to describe other communities as well? So apologies, that's a lot of different questions, but I'm just trying to get some different voices in here and some different intersecting topics for you to respond to. Over to you guys.
Rob, if you don't mind, I'll take the first couple bits.
Sounds good.
Okay. Yeah, so do you see a corresponding romanticizing of the non-urban? I think you can break it down in terms of, like, the answer to this question in short is yes. But the one way to think about it is you've got this kind of romanticizing of this nostalgia for Europe as it was in the past, right? So you've got this kind of like romanticizing of older European architecture. There's actually a picture of that in my slide somewhere. You've got, and then you look at it a little bit more broadly. We do kind of see this kind of this idea of kind of going back to kind of traditional spaces, but I don't know if it's from the same users. It's kind of like parallel discourses that are working together. So the other piece I think is also trying. There's someone named God, I can't remember his name now, but working on kind of like what are the far right imaginative geographies of the environment in general, and what we see is this kind of a return to this environmental determinism over and over again, in which it's kind of like this idea that the earth has particular people that are proper to that part of the earth, and we have to reclaim that sense of kind of authentic ties to the land, right? And if you look at people like Alain de Benoit, who's this kind of new right thinker, he's really talking about kind of how there's this organic relationship between man and land, and liberalism has deracinated man from that. And you know, I don't think that there's a specific strategy around, perhaps around real estate speculation. If it comes out in a few years, to be true, I wouldn't be surprised. But I don't think that that's really what it's about. But I do think it is about undermining specific goods, in the sense of it's kind of like undermining particular groups of people and trying to give a sense of like, don't go there, and then to create this myth about that place. And then the last piece, the no-go zone thing really tends to be constructed around Muslim communities. But if you look at Douglas Murray and you look at Raheem Kassam, there's reference specifically as well to Black communities. And Murray does this a lot when he's talking about Paris. But the no-go zone trope, that tends to be particularly focused around Muslims. I think I'll leave it there and let Rob take the rest.
Yeah, that's interesting, Bharath. I think what's interesting about the Boogaloo Boys is in a way they're almost post no-go zone. I mean, so a lot of the no-go zone discourse, when you read it, you almost get the sense that the people talking about no-go zones have never been to cities, right? They don't know what they're like at all. Maybe they're writing from the suburbs, or maybe the real issue is they're thinking of the city as a symbol of the nation or a symbol of the West. And so the very existence of people they consider non-Western being in the city is a symbol of this kind of broader national and Western decline, which I think links with what you were saying, Bharath, about this kind of, the kind of generation identity sort of discourse of like, we're indigenous in Europe. We have our autochthonous claim to the land, and immigrants are going to dissolve our claim to the land. And the Boogaloo Boys sort of come at it from a different perspective, where, at least I haven't seen them using the kind of culturalist discourse of that. I love that Douglas Murray quote, why aren't they drinking lukewarm beer? And this very kind of linking, direct, very one-to-one kind of correlation between your cultural consumption and your politics. In a way, cultural studies used to work very hard to show that culture was political, and Douglas Murray just kind of aligns any distance immediately with that lukewarm beer comment. But the Boogaloo Boys aren't really interested in culture in that sort of way. So for them, it's sort of post no-go zone. It's almost beyond no-go zone, right? They view the city as sort of almost post-apocalyptic space that needs to be reclaimed. So they're almost not interested in culture. They're interested in the city as kind of an environment that you can enter and retake. So in that sense, their politics can be even less coherent. In that some Boogaloo Boys talk about aligning with Black Lives Matter, but it's also potentially more destructive and in some ways more nihilistic, right? Because it's not really about reclaiming anything. It's more about rebellion, overturning. I mean, it's about civil war, right? That's what they say. So the city is a case for that. But there's the kind of culturalist language of someone like Douglas Murray or Nigel Farage doesn't really surface in the same kind of way.
Okay, so there's a few more questions. There's one here that's fairly particular, so I'm going to ask it on its own. Well, it's a pair of questions from Ushnish Sengupta. First question is, have you determined any per capita numbers? Does population density per neighborhood, town, city matter? And then a kind of second question that follows on this is, any credence to friction and familiarity theories, i.e. the relative proportions of immigrants in an area results in more friction or more familiarity? I suppose one of the things that I might ask as chair, I guess, to rephrase or to situate this question is, I suppose, does the sort of measuring the real city matter for either of you? I mean, are you thinking about correspondence with some kind of a measured city in some way, or is it really that you're questioning and thinking about the city as something like a problematized kind of object or subject?
I'll start with that one because my answer would be I'm really looking at the city the way I guess I'm interested in the way these groups are fantasizing about the city. So I'm not, I don't have a kind of an attempt. I'm not making an objective attempt to kind of measure the city and compare it against what these groups are saying. But I'm interested in the way they're borrowing, and maybe Bharath can talk about this. Rahim Kassam's no-go zone ethnography, right? These groups will borrow the kind of scholarly language and sort of methodological tools to talk about the city. So I showed that one clip of the Atlanta racial dot map. So there's a lot of this in these Telegram channels where they're giving you a kind of, what Lefebvre called an abstract space overview of the city and saying, like, look, this is how it's organized. This is what's tactically important. We need to be able to kind of take the city in at one view and manage it accordingly, or sort of strategically negotiate it. So I do think what's interesting to me anyways, where there's this kind of impulse to objectivity in these groups' fantasies about the city, right? They're saying, look, here's the data. This is how we can then manage and respond to it. And it seems like, I haven't read the No-Go Zones book, though I might have to. It seems like they're kind of, that author's kind of borrowing making a similar sort of move where he's trying to be an ethnographer and say, let me get some data on the city. And it's a similar thing where you see a lot of kind of sort of cultural studies readings from these right-wing groups, these extremist groups, about the politics of culture. And it's an interesting move they make. It's an often frustrating move, but you can see it kind of animating the way that they're thinking about these spaces. I don't know if you've seen similar sorts of things, Bharath.
Yeah, I mean, I think those last points, especially about the way in which kind of that overlay of Atlanta is being used, I think that's really interesting. But for me, I mean, to just borrow what Scott said, right? I mean, it really is a problematization of the city that I'm thinking about here. I mean, like, it's also kind of like what exactly are we asking here? So I guess that might be a bit of the trouble I'm having with this question, which is, why would we want to measure the city in the way? Is it about kind of, do we want to be able to predict or identify like what kinds of places get problematized as no-go zones? I think it's something that really tends to happen through a kind of mediated logic in which, you have this jihadist comes from Molenbeek, and then all of a sudden now it's all about this place, right? And it's I think it's part of a kind of a broader project of measuring not just cities, but measuring what they refer to in many ways as kind of anti-whiteness and the places in which anti-whiteness festers as a way of kind of understanding spaces. So I think, yeah, in terms of that question, I don't think measuring the city in terms of trying to understand how the far right might engage with it really matters. But I do think that there are certain points where it could be really interesting, right? If you want to look at spaces in which there's been like high outflow of white people, or when I've been looking at Stormfront, which is a extreme right forum, a neo-Nazi forum, you get a lot of discussions of people saying, I used to live in Austin and now I moved to this rural part of Texas and my life is so much better. Those might be more interesting ways to measure it and to think about it. But I don't know if that kind of measurement is really going to help us understand how the far right imagines or thinks about the city. And getting into what Rob was talking about, right? I mean, the city becomes kind of all of these things stick to the city. These kind of different affects stick to the city, right? And so that has this kind of really important impact for how people think about belonging and what parts of the city they can actually claim. So I think it's more we want to look at it as a problematization than something measured in itself.
Okay, so I'm going to try and there was 3 ones that I was going to wrap up to finish, but I just see that I think our colleague Kezia has added another one. But let me ask these 3 together. I think have some relationship with each other. First is from Kieran O'Connor, who's left the chat, but it asked, can you talk a little bit about the significance of white nationalist influencers like Mark Collette, R. Spencer, Lauren Southern, who act as amplifiers and steer online communities towards the latest iteration of a no-go zone, etc. In the age of social media, who decides where the next decrepit modern location is, essentially? And I guess there was a kind of related one here from Adam El Jadi, who says, would you say that these expressions of white supremacy are historically unique to digital culture? Is there any precedent in colonialism? And then I guess the last one I wanted to touch on here, and we can come to Kezia if we have time, is from Alan number 2, who says, Bharath's talk suggested that part of the no-go discourse is a critique of social democrats, liberals, and the left, who have allowed, quote unquote, or encouraged this to happen. How important a part is that? Does it connect with an older conservative discourse for which the city is a site of progress, modernity, and vice, the opposite of virtuous, rule, tradition? And for Rob, is that something at stake in Boogaloo, etc.? Is the gaming a way of conquering the city for a post-urban right? And I suppose one of the things I would add just to that, Alan's question is I guess how useful a term, because both of you used the phrase or mentioned Lefebvre's right to the city concept. I mean, one of the things about it, to a certain extent to me, it possibly sits a little bit uncomfortably with these far right discourses in the city, because some of their criticisms sound like criticisms, at least have a family resemblance to criticisms the far right might have of cities, at least the strain of the city that's seen as like, this sort of commodified, liberal, kind of a superficial version of diversity that sometimes would be criticized as part of the capitalist city. So does the right to the city work is something I would add on. You don't have to answer that. Answer the question from the people who have asked.
I'll start, if that's okay. On the first question, I'll start by citing Bharath's paper in Cultural Studies that he just published that talks about, in part, how these sort of more mainstream Twitter users amplify these messages. And maybe I'll just leave it there and let Bharath talk more about that. Because in a way, I'm more interested in sort of, how does this stuff take shape almost without anyone. I mean, there's not really anyone in control, right? Bharath talks about how the sort of more mainstream users can conjugate it or direct it or orientate it to something, and they can shift attention in that way. But for the most part, they're not the ones who create it. It kind of bubbles up and emerges. And so the colonial question is an interesting one, because the short answer is no. I mean, these things are not new in a lot of ways, and they draw on a long history of racism that has long been nurtured in the West. And particularly the colonial imaginary is really important, right? Where they're, the Boogaloo Boys are referring to Rhodesia all the time, right? So there's this kind of idea of they want to reclaim what they see as a lost role of the white man as conqueror, right? And so that's why I was talking about the theft of enjoyment, right? This idea that minorities are having too much fun, they're having too much sex, they're too violent, and they're doing that in the city. And so that's what we need to take back, right? We're not having fun because they're having fun, right? So it's about reclaiming that, and the colonial fantasy animates that. Sometimes explicitly with the Boogaloo Boys, sometimes sort of and Rhodesia, sometimes less directly. I mean, the no-go zones, I think, is there's a way to read that as kind of colonial discourse about subduing natives, but it's less explicit. But I do think one thing that's interesting that's happening with the kind of transnational nature of this is there's a way a kind of colonial vision is being layered onto kind of anti-blackness. Not that the two are necessarily separate. I mean, obviously they're related, but in the U.S. example, at least, the Boogaloo Boys are not necessarily using the kind of typical anti-black rhetoric. Sometimes they are, but they're not necessarily using the typical kind of anti-black rhetoric you might expect. They're talking about the city as sort of a space that's been invaded, right? So there's this kind of way the kind of Islam invasion, the rhetoric of an Islamic invasion is kind of shaping the way these groups are thinking about the city. And you kind of see that in Trump. I mean, there's a documented history of him being racist against black people when he was a landlord, but it doesn't really enter into, well, this is changing a little bit, I suppose, with Black Lives Matter. But you know, in his first years as president, that didn't enter into his public statements so much as Mexicans and Muslims, right? Because he could position them as invading outsiders. So there's this kind of way these groups are thinking about what they view as their cities as taken over by this sort of invading force, and they need to reclaim it. But ultimately, I think, to kind of wrap this up, I don't think these groups really like the city. I mean, I think reactionaries have never really liked the city ever since Edmund Burke, right? They don't like it. They want to subdue it. They want it to be in control, which is to say they kind of want to kill it, right? So I don't think they actually want to reclaim it. I think they want to restore order, is the way they're thinking about it. So the colonial fantasy is very much active in that kind of thinking.
Okay, to pick up from Rob, I mean, I think that was a really perfect way of describing the kind of aspects around colonialism and imperialism and where these actually come from. This is old, you know, it's just new packages. I wonder, maybe there's some new things, like genuinely new things happening with the Boogaloo Boys, but even then it fits in with that broader set of frameworks, I guess. Yeah, I mean, thanks, Rob, for plugging my paper a bit there. I think maybe an interesting thing to pick up on here is that what you notice is that someone like Lauren Southern picks up what she picks up based on what's also there in the media, right? And it's also kind of like these kind of concepts of what the next iteration of the no-go zone is. I mean, I don't think that it's actually iterative so much as the goal is to show how this pattern repeats itself all over Europe, everywhere there's been an acceptance of diversity. I think it's less about an iteration so much as kind of like adding on and documenting. And one of the things that kind of came up when I was working on that paper is that what we see is that you'll have someone like Lauren Southern or Mark Collette kind of make some kind of claim, right? Oh, okay, you know, another anti-white attack or whatever. And then people go out and the audiences are really out there trying to document, oh, this really happened, look at this. And that kind of has a way of kind of shaping the participatory culture. So in a sense, who decides where the next decrepit modern location is? The real question is, what is the next place they're going to problematize? And I think that, you know, that happens between actual phenomena in the world, right? Like maybe there's a terrorist attack somewhere, right? And then its mediatization by the press, and then it becomes this kind of object that people begin to discuss in this way, as both of us have been trying to describe. I just want to touch on this kind of claim around the no-go discourse as a critique of the social democrats, liberals, and the left. I think it's important in that when we really dig into that, it shows the kind of clarity of how white supremacist this really is, and that it's really only white liberals that are afforded even agency, right? Like the migrants are just objects that are invasive and problematic, right? And they're sort of treated in this kind of as animals, really. And on the other hand, you have kind of like the blame that's placed on the kind of like establishment. And I think it's important to bring it up primarily because we always kind of try to, well, not we, but I mean, there's been this really big movement to try to frame this as populism, right? And it's this kind of rejection of the establishment that sort of proves that that is populism. And I think this is really, really what's one of those things that can be really problematic, is because when we use that term populism, we sort of sanitize it. When this reaction to the establishment is not that they have a problem necessarily with liberals per se, but they have a problem with liberals because they accept multiculturalism, and that's what's ruining the country and the cities, right? So it goes back to what Rob was saying about imposing order. It's liberals and social democrats and the left who seem to be trying, in their view, to try to like maintain this disorder. And I think one can look at kind of, you know, the culture wars about in the mid-century in the United States, but also just in the ways in which people described like jazz music in the early 20th century, right, as kind of this sort of space of vice. And then you had against that this kind of idea of the white rural spaces as you know, the real patriotic and American spaces, or the, you know, the true European places.
Thanks.
I don't know if there's something else in there, so sorry if I missed something.
Yeah, I think you covered it really well, Bharath. I want to just finish with the question from Kezia. I think it's a good question to end with, one that's actually reflexive as well around what we're doing right now. So Kezia says, can I ask a question about researcher safety and undertaking research in this domain, particularly in the context we are now in, that presentations are recorded and made available on the internet? So a little bit of a parting question, which just has to do with doing research like this and doing it in a way that is maybe more visible than it might have been if we weren't doing this online. I'd like to begin.
Well, perhaps I'll start because there's a personal story. I remember Rob and I were at the International Studies Association in Toronto last year, and I had gotten a hate email, but it was a really weird one. Rob, I don't know if you remember, like it was something like, "You won't shut down my meme complex" or whatever. I mean, I think for us, it's important to be conscious about our security, and it's you know, it's about kind of things like I try to avoid making like having my address online, but at the same time, you know, it's pretty easy to figure out where I work and make a decent guess as to what building I might be in. Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of researcher safety, it's if you're a faculty member, I think it's a little easier to make these kinds of requests to your departments, like about how to invest in security. And I think in that case, I'd be much more worried about how are PhD students supposed to make those kinds of claims? How are they supposed to manage their security in that? But I mean, I think it's also kind of like we also, as academics, we have public emails, so we get a lot of, we might get some hate mail and that kind of thing. And there, I think it's much more of a kind of managing one's mental health. And I think when I got that message, and it was kind of like I think Rob and I were having a drink, it was kind of like I could say like, oh man, look at this. And that helps to sort of, at least for me, kind of mellow out how much that can be faced.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good way of thinking about it, Bharath. And I think it's important to emphasize that this sort of work is more dangerous for people who are already more marginal, whether because of their lack of a permanent job or because they're not white men. So in that sense, it's easier for me to do this than it might be for someone else, and maybe slightly harder to target me, although certainly not impossible. But it's another, you know, back to the earlier question about doing this research. We don't have very good answers to this, and I think in some ways it's because these groups are ahead of the people trying to respond to them. In some ways, it's our lack of solidarity as academics, how we work on our own all the time and don't support each other enough. So even things like Bharath was saying, having a drink and talking these things through can help, but we don't really have institutions and infrastructures to help researchers, particularly vulnerable researchers, doing this work. So I think that's something we need to build on and work on in an organized way, because right now it is, it's just not, the support isn't there, I would say.
Well, thanks to you both. I mean, I think that's a really good way to end, and maybe something to take away is ways of being more inventive of how we support each other, particularly in the circumstances we're in right now, where we aren't able to have that sort of propinquitous drink or coffee or whatever, where we're able to commiserate or discuss the problems we face in our research. So there's got to be other ways to deal with this in the current situation we're in. But with that, I'd like to thank Bharath and Rob for excellent presentations, excellent discussions. Also, everyone who's stayed with us for so long. There was quite a few people attending this, and really excellent questions. And finally, just to thank Mara Nogueira, who's still with us and gave a good introduction to the Urban Intersections series. I hope you will come back to some of our future events. And also just to thank Damali Raymond as well from our events team, who was helping us in the background and keeping things running smoothly. So I'm going to switch off my camera. I think everyone's going to switch off their cameras, and the chat may be on for a little bit longer, but thanks again, Rob. Thanks again, Bharath.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.